Mr. Thompson here. We're looking at U.S. History Standard 7, investigate the political, economic, and social developments during the age of Jackson. More specifically, we're looking at Part A of that standard, explain Jacksonian democracy, including expanding suffrage, the nullification crisis and states' rights, and the Indian Removal Act. Andrew Jackson emerged from the War of 1812 as a very popular war hero. He soon entered the political arena and questioned the framework for democracy. He started challenging the Democratic Republicans for their expansion of power. He believed that the party's original mission to restrict the federal government and protect and preserve states' rights and individuals was being lost in the country's growth. Instead of supporting individuals, states, and agricultural pursuits, Jackson said that the Democratic Republicans were too busy and focused on industrial pursuits and expanding federal power and the upper class. The aggressive challenge that Jackson threw at the Democratic Republicans ended the national unity brought about by the era of good feelings and returned America back to a two-party system. Jackson and his supporters shared a political philosophy later referred to as Jacksonian democracy. It sought a stronger presidency and executive branch and a weaker Congress. Out of respect for the common man, they also sought to broaden public participation in government through expanding voting rights to include all adult white males, not just landowners. This universal male suffrage dramatically increased voter turnout. For example, the election of 1824 saw about 350,000 voters. However, with the expansion of voter eligibility, the election of 1840 saw 2.4 million voters. Most of the new voters were from the lower classes who had previously not been allowed to vote due to property requirements. These common men usually supported Andrew Jackson, rightfully so. He was the universal male suffrage proponent. And this new group ended up forming a new party. The supporters of Jackson, the Democratic Party, the Common Man Party. The old Democratic Republican Party also transitioned into the Whig Party. The Whig Party usually favored industrial progress and was typically made up of the upper classes. The U.S. was once again divided between two political parties with two very different ideologies and goals. You had the Democratic Party, the Common Man Party, and you had the Whig Party, the upper classes, industrial pursuits, with the Democratic Party, more agricultural pursuits. Another principle of Jacksonian democracy was this idea that politicians should be allowed to give their followers jobs in the government as a way to limit the power of the elites. This process became known as the spoils system. Jackson believed that the president had to make sure the executive branch was working to carry out the things that the party in power wanted. A way to do that was to give the government jobs that were very important to those people who had proved their loyalty through working on the campaign. However, this spoils system that Jackson implemented sometimes led to corruption and also unqualified workers getting jobs. Jacksonian democracy also favored limiting the power of the federal government in favor of expanding state power. The issue of states' rights was a highly debated topic in the early 19th century. This idea of who held the supreme power. Was it the federal government or was it the states? The root of the argument became fixed in the constitutional debates between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The issue then reemerged in 1798 with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which opposed the legality of the Alien and Sedition Acts. The issue of whether states could nullify federal law, so cancel federal law, nearly split the United States. Congress had passed the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 to protect American manufacturers from competition with cheaper British imported goods. Now, Southerners believed that the tariffs were passed to purposely hurt Southern plantation owners and to help the Northern industrialists because the Southerners didn't have access to the cheaper imported British goods, while the Northern industrialists lined their pockets. So, in response, South Carolina legislatures nullified the tariff. Andrew Jackson's vice president, John Calhoun, argued with the president on the rights of states to nullify, so to cancel, federal laws that the states opposed. Calhoun, a South Carolinian, resigned from his position of vice president to lead the effort in states' rights. He even went so far to suggest that South Carolina secede from the Union, so leave the Union. Calhoun's loyalty to the southern states' interests, as opposed to the whole nation's interests, so the good of staying unified, really displays how divided the nation had become over this issue of states' rights. The nullification crisis was resolved when a compromise tariff was passed and Jackson was given the authority to enforce federal law by using the Army and Navy. South Carolina then backed down from its threats to secede, to leave the Union. This example shows how even though Jacksonian democracy upholds states' rights, it's willing to limit states' rights when those rights threaten the Union as a whole. The nullification crisis really had a profound effect on North-South relations. Calhoun continued to vocally support states' rights and started to build up this group of Southerners, like-minded, that they wouldn't back down if another issue presented itself. Slave owners began to wonder what would happen if the federal government decided to end slavery by law. Andrew Jackson's democratic philosophy and appeal to the common man did not include American Indians. In Jackson's military career, he was known for attacks on the Seminole and Creek tribes during the War of 1812. Once Jackson was elected president, he worked to expand the land available for white settlement. In order to achieve this, he signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which forced Indians off of their lands to resettle west of the Mississippi River. The American Indians would be given land in the west in exchange for their lands in the east. While most tribes resented this policy, they reluctantly complied. However, a few tribes, like the Cherokee Nation in Georgia, refused to give up their land. Georgia had passed a statute to abolish the Cherokee government and laws in the eyes of the state. This was going to be used to then take control of the lands that had actually been granted to the Cherokee through a treaty in 1791. This issue in Georgia was really important because they had actually discovered gold in the northern part of the state, which was on Cherokee lands. Of course, where there's gold, all these settlers were flocking to the state where these lands were held by Cherokee. The Cherokee filed suit to challenge the loss of their land. The case was heard by the Supreme Court in Worcester versus Georgia. Chief Justice John Marshall issued the ruling where they decided that Georgia didn't have the right to take away Cherokee land. After the Supreme Court issued their ruling, President Jackson openly challenged the Supreme Court and John Marshall and said, "They have made their decision, now let's see them enforce it." In 1835, the Georgia Cherokee reluctantly gave up their land. Over the next few years, the Cherokee were forced to travel west over what became known as the Trail of Tears. The forced removal was difficult, and thousands of Native Americans died along the way due to starvation, disease, and exhaustion. Jacksonian democracy is a term that encompasses more than just the 8 years Jackson served as president. It's more of a general term that encompasses the formation of the Democratic Party, the Jackson presidency, and the broad political reforms that brought about the political participation of the common man through the 1830s up to the 1850s. However, not all groups were included in the Jacksonian democracy movement. Even though universal male suffrage was achieved through Jacksonian democracy, American Indians, free and enslaved blacks, and women didn't actually benefit from the equality values that the term suggests.